The night air buzzed with the familiar pulse of a college town coming alive. It was the end of March 2006, and in Columbus, Ohio, the city's South Campus gateway was alight with neon and energy. For students of The Ohio State University, it was the beginning of spring break, a sacred week of escape, excess, and for some, reflection. For Brian Shaffer, it was supposed to be all of that and more. Brian was 27, tall, fit, and easygoing, with a lazy grin and an ambition buried just beneath the surface. He was in his second year of medical school at OSU, following a dream he had clung to since childhood, fueled in part by the loss of his mother, Renee, who had passed away just 3 weeks earlier from myelodysplasia. Her death had shaken Brian's world, and those closest to him noticed a flicker of something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. But Brian pressed on, returning to school with a quiet resilience. Spring break loomed ahead, and with it, a planned trip to Miami with his girlfriend, Alexis Wagoner, a fellow med student. On Friday, March 31st, the week before their vacation, Alexis returned home to visit family, while Brian made plans to go out with his friend Clint Florence. He'd spoken to Alexis earlier in the day, told her he loved her, and promised to talk again before their flight on Monday. That night, he met Clint around 9:30 p.m. at the ugly Tuna Saloona, a bar perched on the second level of the bustling South Campus gateway. Surveillance cameras captured him entering the venue, a grainy figure in jeans and a short-sleeved olive-green shirt, standing out just slightly with his confident stride. From there, the night unfolded like countless others in college towns across America. The friends bar-hopped down High Street, stopping for drinks and shots, joined briefly by a friend named Meredith Reed, who gave them a ride back to the ugly Tuna around 1:15 a.m. The trio rode the escalator to the second floor, re-entering the bar as security cameras rolled. Brian appeared slightly unsteady on his feet, but not alarmingly so. He seemed to be enjoying the night, leaning into it, maybe trying to escape something just below the surface. At 1:55 a.m., Brian was seen on the bar's security footage, standing just outside the entrance with Clint and Meredith. He appeared to say something, laughed, and then stepped slightly out of view toward the bar's entrance. Clint and Meredith turned and walked back inside. That was the last time anyone saw Brian Shaffer. The next morning, Alexis tried calling Brian. No answer. That wasn't unusual. Brian could sleep late after a night out, or maybe he had his phone off. But as the hours ticked by, her worry deepened. She called again and again. By that evening, she contacted Brian's father, Randy Shaffer. They filed a missing persons report with Columbus police. When investigators began combing through the security footage at the ugly Tuna, what they found only deepened the mystery. Brian was seen entering the bar at 1:15 a.m., and again briefly at 1:55 a.m. with his friends. But there was no footage of him ever leaving. The ugly Tuna Saloona had only two public entrances, the main one, where patrons entered via an escalator and were covered by multiple surveillance cameras, and a back service door used mostly by employees, connected to a rarely used freight elevator and a locked construction site. Both exits were monitored. No one matching Brian's appearance was seen exiting the bar. The theory that he slipped past the cameras unnoticed was considered, but police reviewed the footage meticulously, frame by frame, and even tracked every individual seen entering and exiting the venue that night. Every single person was accounted for except Brian. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. At first, investigators thought maybe Brian had left through the back service door, but this theory had its flaws. The exit opened into a dangerous, poorly lit construction zone. It would have been a treacherous path for anyone, especially a man who had been drinking heavily. There were no scuff marks, no signs of injury, no trace of Brian, and crucially, no surveillance footage showing him back there either. Police also entertained the idea that he had left disguised or hidden behind a group. They checked whether he might have changed clothes or ducked under another person's arm, but nothing supported that. There was no blind spot large enough or long enough for someone to disappear without being seen. Days passed. The search widened. Flyers with Brian's face were plastered across campus, on telephone poles, and in coffee shops. Local and national media picked up the story. A reward was offered. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Police scoured alleyways, dumpsters, and the nearby Olentangy River. Nothing. Not a wallet, not a shoe, not a phone. Brian had vanished without a single physical trace. His friends were questioned repeatedly. Clint Florence, one of the last people to see him, hired a lawyer and refused to take a polygraph test. Meredith Reed, who had spent far less time with Brian that night, cooperated with police. Alexis, devastated, called his phone daily sometimes just to hear his voicemail. Then, in one chilling moment, her call to Brian's number rang. For a few agonizing seconds, it wasn't voicemail. It was a real ring, a connection. Then it went dead. Cellular records confirmed the phone pinged a tower in Hilliard, a suburb of Columbus. But authorities said it was likely a network glitch or a transient signal bounce. The phone was never found. Randy Shaffer, Brian's father, never stopped searching. He spent years pushing for leads, checking tips, and even visiting psychic mediums in desperation. He stood on street corners with posters. He knocked on doors. He spoke to media, pleaded for information, and haunted the streets near the ugly Tuna, hoping that something, anything, would surface. But nothing ever did. Brian's disappearance would soon become one of the most baffling cases in Ohio history. A man with no reason to run, a promising future, a grieving father, a waiting girlfriend, a bar surrounded by cameras, and a night that ended in silence. For all the hours of video, interviews, and searches for all the technological advances in surveillance and forensics, no one could explain how a man walked into a bar and was never seen again. But the story was far from over. In the first few days after Brian Shaffer vanished, it was easy to believe that he would walk back into his apartment with a sheepish grin and a story to tell. College students did reckless things all the time. They ran away, disappeared for a weekend, turned up at a beach town with blurry memories and sunburns. But this wasn't that. There was no trace, no hint of impulsiveness, no packed bag. Brian had left behind everything. His apartment was untouched, his car was still parked at the complex, and his passport and wallet remained exactly where he had left them. His girlfriend, Alexis, had spent that weekend in Toledo with her family, exchanging texts and calls with Brian before he disappeared. They had been planning a trip to Miami. She hadn't noticed anything off in their last conversations. No tension, no hesitation. Just the same Brian, upbeat, excited, maybe a little tired from classes and grief, but still himself. When he told her, "I love you," on the phone the night before he disappeared, there was no sense that it might be the last time. The police were now under pressure to deliver answers. The timeline of that night had been reconstructed as tightly as possible. Brian entered the ugly Tuna Saloona around 1:15 a.m. with Clint and Meredith. At 1:55 a.m., surveillance footage captured him again, laughing and chatting outside the entrance with his friends, then gone. No footage of him inside after that. No footage of him leaving. Investigators double-checked every available camera. They pulled surveillance from other businesses along High Street. They reviewed footage from nearby stairwells, escalators, emergency exits, and service corridors. No Brian. Every patron was matched and identified. Every exit was accounted for. The space, according to police, simply didn't allow for a clean getaway. Someone would have noticed. But the ugly Tuna wasn't just a bar. It was a maze, a two-level business space surrounded by under-construction storefronts and back corridors that looped behind the public view. The construction area behind the bar was dimly lit and filled with debris, equipment, and blind corners. If Brian had exited through the service door, he would have faced a dangerous, uneven terrain and no clear path to anywhere. That exit was not meant for public use, and certainly not for someone under the influence. Still, it remained the only logical exit unmonitored by cameras. Police explored it thoroughly. No footprints, blood, torn clothing, nothing to indicate an accident. No one remembered seeing him in that area, and besides, where would he have gone? The stairwell led to a freight elevator that required a key to operate. If Brian had stumbled through that path, he would have either ended up in a locked mechanical space or fallen into danger. But no body was found. No trace. Friends and family were brought in for questioning. Clint Florence's behavior quickly drew attention. Unlike other friends, he refused to take a polygraph test and lawyered up early. While this isn't illegal or necessarily suspicious, it raised eyebrows. Police suspected Clint may have known more than he was letting on, but with no evidence, no proof of foul play, no crime scene, there was little they could do. Meredith, the other friend, cooperated fully. She passed a polygraph and answered every question. So did others who had seen Brian that night. No one reported arguments, odd behavior, or tension between Brian and anyone else. According to everyone, he had simply been having a good time. And yet, as the days turned into weeks, the questions began to mount. Was Brian depressed over his mother's death enough to take his own life? Friends and family doubted it. While he had been visibly shaken by Renee's passing, he had returned to school quickly and had spoken about honoring her memory by becoming a doctor. He had planned a trip with Alexis. He'd spoken excitedly about their future together. Still, police didn't dismiss the possibility. They searched the nearby Olentangy River. Nothing. No scent trails for dogs, no clothing, no signs that a man had fallen or jumped. Another theory emerged. Brian had decided to start a new life, a clean break. Some believed the grief of losing his mother, the pressure of med school, and the sudden onset of spring break may have catalyzed the decision to disappear. But this didn't hold up either. He had no financial transactions after that night, no credit card usage, no cell phone activity. His passport was untouched. Even in 2006, faking one's disappearance was not so simple. And those who knew Brian said it was unthinkable. He was deeply connected to his family, especially to his younger brother, Derek. He had never expressed interest in abandoning his life, nor had he made preparations. Over the next several months, tips came in, but none led anywhere. A handful of sightings were reported across Ohio and beyond. In Michigan, someone claimed to have seen a man matching Brian's description in a homeless shelter. Another said he was spotted playing guitar on the street in Atlanta. Police followed up each tip, but all were dead ends. None of them were Brian. Meanwhile, Alexis kept calling his phone, hoping for anything. In one eerie moment, about a week after the disappearance, the phone rang. It didn't go to voicemail right away. It rang 3 times. She froze, then hung up. When the family checked with the phone company, they confirmed that the signal had pinged a tower in Hilliard, a town roughly 14 miles from the bar. But phone experts dismissed it as a likely ghost ring, a technical glitch that doesn't mean the phone was active. Still, for Alexis, it felt like a sliver of hope. Someone, somewhere, had that phone. Years passed. The police maintained that there was no evidence of foul play. But there was also no evidence of any natural disappearance. No proof of accident. No indication of suicide. Just nothing. Brian's father, Randy, became a relentless advocate. He spoke at vigils, handed out flyers, and joined online forums dedicated to finding missing people. He pushed for the Columbus Division of Police to keep the investigation active. He appeared on national news, urging anyone with information, no matter how small, to come forward. He never gave up. In one particularly emotional plea, Randy told reporters that he still left the porch light on every night, in case Brian came home. That if he was alive and hiding, he would forgive him. That if something had happened, he just wanted the truth. Tragically, in 2008, just 2 years after Brian disappeared, Randy was killed in a freak accident when a tree fell during a windstorm. His search ended not with answers, but with a quiet, senseless tragedy. At his funeral, mourners left messages for Brian, hoping against hope that he was alive and somehow watching. Brian's younger brother, Derek, picked up the torch, continuing the campaign for answers. But as the years passed, the trail grew colder. No new evidence emerged. No suspects. No solid theories. Online forums exploded with speculation. Some amateur sleuths claimed Clint knew something that his refusal to take a polygraph was damning. Others theorized that Brian had gotten into an altercation inside the bar and had been hidden or disposed of by staff. But no one at the bar that night reported any fight, no suspicious activity, no blood, no missing persons. The ugly Tuna staff had nothing to hide, according to investigators, and again, no evidence. More bizarre theories surfaced, that Brian was abducted by human traffickers or targeted by someone he didn't even know, that he never left the bar because something sinister happened within its walls, perhaps in a blind spot, perhaps in the back. But for that to be true, someone would have had to cover it up seamlessly. And all employees, managers, and patrons had been interviewed and cleared. There were no signs of a struggle. No one reported anything out of the ordinary. As of today, the ugly Tuna Saloona is closed. The bar shuttered after years of fading business and association with the case. The cameras that once held the final glimpse of Brian are dark now. The space is just another building, an empty shell with echoes of laughter, music, and mystery. The Columbus police maintain that the case is still open. Brian Shaffer remains listed as a missing person. His photo is still circulated every year on the anniversary of his disappearance. Age progression sketches have been made, imagining what he might look like now in his 40s, perhaps with a beard, more weathered, more cautious. But behind all the theories, rumors, and failed leads, one thing remains hauntingly clear. A man walked into a bar under the watchful eye of security cameras and never walked out. And to this day, no one can explain how. As time stretched onward, the Brian Shaffer case evolved from a high-priority missing persons investigation into one of the most baffling cold cases in modern American history. By now, hundreds of cases had been solved using grainy surveillance footage, shaky cell phone pings, or anonymous tips. But in Brian's case, those tools normally invaluable had led nowhere. Detectives who had once combed the ugly Tuna Saloona for clues had moved on to new cases. Leads that had once seemed promising faded into obscurity. Posters bearing Brian's smiling face, a photo that hadn't aged, because he hadn't been seen since remained tacked to bulletin boards on campus, weathered and sun-bleached, a permanent symbol of absence. The cold truth was this. No one had any idea what happened to Brian Shaffer. Columbus police continued to treat the investigation as open, but by the 3rd year of his disappearance, they had little more than they had in the first month. His bank accounts had not been touched. His email hadn't been accessed. His phone was dead. His Social Security number showed no activity. His passport, left behind in his apartment, had never been used. In every sense measurable by the systems that track modern life, Brian had ceased to exist. And yet, there were no signs that he had died either. The discomfort in this case lies not in what is known, but in what is missing. Every theory seemed to reach a wall, a place where reason broke down. The first theory to gain momentum in those early months was that Brian had simply walked away from his life. To those unfamiliar with the emotional toll of grief, the idea didn't seem far-fetched. Brian's mother had passed just weeks before. The pressure of medical school was immense. Maybe, just maybe, he decided he couldn't take it anymore. Maybe he vanished on purpose. But this theory collapsed under scrutiny. If Brian had run away, why not prepare? He had no getaway plan, no withdrawal of funds, no changes in behavior. He was planning a trip with Alexis, a vacation he seemed excited for. There were no arguments with family or friends. There was no note, no closure. More than that, Brian was close to his younger brother, Derek. He would have told him something. Alexis, too, their relationship was serious. She had been thinking of marriage. She would later say, with quiet certainty, "He wouldn't have left me." So police entertained a darker possibility that Brian had never left the bar alive. That something had happened inside the ugly Tuna Saloona, a fight, a fall, an accident, and that his body had been hidden or disposed of before anyone could notice. They returned to the site, combed through dumpsters, utility closets, back stairwells. They searched the construction zone behind the bar again and again. They found nothing, no blood, no broken furniture, no evidence. It didn't add up. The bar had limited space, a handful of exits, and was surrounded by cameras. There were no blind spots large enough for a murder, and certainly not a disposal. There had been no cleanup, no cover-up, no noise that anyone remembered. Staff members were questioned extensively. No one saw anything unusual. Then there was the footage, the one damning piece of evidence that both illuminated and obscured everything. Brian was seen entering the bar around 1:15 a.m. He was caught again at 1:55 a.m. outside the entrance, speaking with Clint and Meredith. He then turned to walk back into the bar and was never seen again. Police studied that tape obsessively. They verified every person who left. They looked for misdirection, disguises, diversions. But everyone who went in came out except Brian. If he never left, where did he go? Some believed he may have disguised himself, perhaps traded shirts or ducked under a group. But this seemed unlikely. The video was clear. No group left large enough to obscure him. No person left matching his build, height, or face. It would have required Hollywood-level precision. And for what reason? Another theory surfaced in online forums, that Brian had fallen victim to a rogue act of violence, someone slipping something into his drink, or an opportunistic killer with access to the bar's service areas. Perhaps a stranger, or even someone he knew. Yet again there was no proof. No patrons reported unusual behavior. No drugs were found. No one acted out of place. Desperate for answers, Brian's father, Randy, turned to psychics, private investigators, and amateur sleuths. He received letters, emails, and phone calls from all over the country, each one claiming to know something, promising a lead. Most were scams. Some were cruel jokes. A few were sincere, but none were helpful. In one letter, a self-proclaimed medium claimed Brian had been lured away from the bar and was buried in a construction site. Police followed up. They searched the location. Nothing. Another caller said Brian had been taken by a sex trafficking ring and was alive in another state. That too led nowhere. But perhaps the most bizarre speculation of all came from internet users who connected Brian's disappearance to a larger theory, the Smiley face killers. This theory, born from a group of former detectives and criminologists, suggested that a network of killers was targeting young, successful men across the Midwest, abducting them after nights out and dumping their bodies in rivers. In many of these cases, smiley face graffiti had been found near the sites where the men were last seen or where their bodies were discovered. Though some of these deaths were ruled accidental drownings, the pattern, they argued, was too consistent to ignore. Fit young men, often with promising futures, disappearing under similar circumstances. Some were found, Some never were. Columbus was not far from other cities on that alleged circuit. Supporters of the theory pointed out that Brian fit the profile, a young, good-looking man with no reason to run, no history of depression, vanishing near water after a night of drinking. But the theory lacked critical evidence. No smiley-face graffiti had been found near the ugly Tuna Saloona. No indication that Brian had left the bar, much less encountered a stranger outside. Still, the idea haunted many. What if he had been targeted? Years ticked by. In 2014, nearly a decade after Brian's disappearance, Alexis Waggoner, the girlfriend he had planned to fly to Miami with, got married. She had waited, long after most people would have moved on. But even then, she told reporters, she still thought of Brian often. "There's no closure," she said. "There never has been." Online communities kept the case alive. Podcasts, YouTube channels, and Reddit threads dissected every second of surveillance footage, every quote from friends and family, every police report. People obsessed over the footage. Some believed Brian had never actually re-entered the bar, that he turned and walked somewhere else. But this didn't explain the total lack of sightings, the missing footage, the phone ping. Others fixated on Clint Florence's refusal to take a polygraph. Why, they asked. Would a best friend refuse to cooperate? Police responded with caution. While they wished Clint had taken the test, they emphasized that he was under no legal obligation to do so, and that without evidence, there was nothing to tie him to any wrongdoing. Still, the suspicion remained. Then in 2020, the case resurfaced briefly when the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation added Brian's DNA to their database, allowing for cross-checking with unidentified remains across the country. It was a hopeful step, but it led to no matches. By now, nearly 2 decades have passed. Brian would be 45 years old. His friends have moved on. Most of the detectives originally assigned to the case have retired or transferred, but the questions remain frozen in time. Where did he go? Did he leave by his own choice, slipping into the shadows with a new name, a new life? Did something terrible happen to him that night, something witnessed, maybe even known, but never spoken aloud? Was it a perfect crime? An accident? A cover-up? Or was it something else, entirely something that defies logic, explanation, or even imagination? To this day, Brian Shaffer remains one of the most confounding missing persons cases in the United States. A man who simply and impossibly disappeared into the night. Years after Brian Shaffer disappeared, Columbus remains haunted by the question that refuses to die. How does someone vanish from a bar surrounded by cameras, people, and light in the heart of a city? How can a man so loved, so connected, so alive in every sense of the word, cease to exist without a ripple? To understand why Brian's case still captures attention, one must understand the eerie perfection of its circumstances. He was not alone in the wilderness. He was not traveling in a dangerous country. He wasn't hiking, flying, or driving into a storm. He was standing outside a bar on a major city street, and then he wasn't. There's something existential about it, something almost mythic. It strikes a primal fear, the idea that one day you could be among friends, in public, and still disappear without a trace. And for those who knew him, that fear is compounded by grief, a grief that has no bottom, no funeral, no goodbye, no explanation. Alexis Waggoner, who had planned to spend her life with Brian, moved on with time but never fully let go. In interviews over the years, she described the agony of wondering, the pain of not knowing if the man you love is alive somewhere or buried beneath concrete. It's not like losing someone to death, she once said. It's like losing them to silence. Derek Shaffer, Brian's younger brother carried the burden too. After their father Randy's tragic death in 2008, Derek became the last immediate family member keeping the torch lit. He's spoken rarely in public, perhaps because there is so little left to say. Each year brings the same question. Is this the year we find out? Yet time is not kind to cold cases. Witnesses forget. Camera footage is erased or lost. Buildings are torn down. New crimes take priority. Detectives retire, tips slow, leads fade. And so too does the public's interest replaced by newer mysteries. Still, the case remains technically open. Brian is still listed as a missing person in the National Missing and Unidentified Person System. His DNA, fingerprints, and dental records are stored in federal databases. His age progression images are updated every few years. If someone, somewhere, finds something, a body, a clue, a memory, authorities are ready. But with each passing year, it becomes harder to believe that a breakthrough will come. The question remains, what happened between 1:56 a.m. and 2 a.m. on April 1st, 2006? Some point to the construction site behind the ugly Tuna Saloona, the only exit not covered by a security camera. It's possible, they say, that Brian left through the back door, perhaps looking for air, or simply confused. Maybe he fell. Maybe something happened that the cameras couldn't catch. But even that theory feels too easy. The police searched the construction zone. Cadaver dogs swept it. No blood, no scent trail, no evidence of injury. Nothing. Others hold fast to the theory that Brian never left the bar at all, that something happened inside a fight, an overdose, a freak accident, and that someone covered it up. Maybe bar staff, maybe strangers, maybe even someone he knew. But here again, no evidence. No one at the bar reported suspicious activity. The place was full of people. The bar was closed later that night with no interruptions. No one saw blood. No one heard a fight. And police searched every inch of the building. Then there's Clint, Florence, Brian's friend, and the last person confirmed to see him. Clint never took a polygraph. He hired an attorney and stayed silent. While this raises suspicions for many, legally it means little. He wasn't charged. He wasn't caught in a lie. And he was never named a suspect. Still, people ask, if you had nothing to hide, why not talk? But silence is not guilt, not in the eyes of the law, and suspicion is not proof. Others explore fringe theories. Brian was targeted by someone, abducted for unknown reasons. Some still mention the smiley face killer theory, despite lack of evidence. Others believe he suffered a sudden medical episode, a stroke, seizure, or blackout, and stumbled somewhere unreachable. But if so, why was no body ever found? Columbus is not a place where people vanish. It is a city, not a jungle. If Brian had collapsed or fallen, someone would have found him. A camera would have caught something. A search dog would have picked up the scent. A piece of clothing, a footprint, a trace something. But there was nothing. And so the case remains in a category all its own, a true mystery, a hole in time. Online communities remain captivated. YouTube documentaries, Reddit threads, and podcasts continue to ask the same questions. They analyze the footage again and again. Was there a frame missed? A detail overlooked? They theorize about the phone ping, the friendships, the bar's layout, the possibilities. But despite thousands of hours of collective obsession, no one has been able to explain how Brian Shaffer walked into a bar and never came out. The ugly Tuna Saloona has since closed. The building, once a hub of nightlife, sits quiet now. People walk past it every day, unaware that the space holds one of the most disturbing mysteries in Ohio history. And sometimes that's how it is with these cases. They don't end with justice. They don't end with clarity. They simply stop. For those left behind, the silence becomes a second prison. Randy Shaffer died believing his son was out there somewhere alive, perhaps watching, perhaps afraid to return. Alexis lived years in suspended grief, always wondering. Derek still lives with the unanswerable. What if? What really happened? And then there are the unanswered details. Why didn't Brian tell anyone he was leaving, if he intended to? Why did his phone ring a week later? Why did no camera, not one, catch his exit? The truth, whatever it is, has stayed buried. And maybe that's the most terrifying part of all. In a world full of information, surveillance, and footprints, Brian left none. His story ends at the threshold of a bar, beneath the glow of a sign that promised drinks and music. He stepped through those doors and into history not as a man who made mistakes or enemies, but as a man who simply disappeared. Maybe someday a clue will surface, a confession, a discovery in a construction site, a scrap of clothing in a river, a long-lost phone. Maybe. Or maybe not. Maybe the mystery of Brian Shaffer will never be solved, and his name will forever remain a ghost in the wires, a question without an answer, an echo in the silence. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share